Here are 9 Lightroom editing tips to bring your flower images to the next level. Colorful flower shots are a great eye catcher, but don't rely on global vibrance and saturation sliders to boost colors. Instead, try the sliders available to you in the calibration panel of Lightroom. Here you can not only target the saturation of different colors, but also change the hue. The great thing is, this works completely different than the HSL settings, meaning when, for example, bringing down the blue primary hue, not only will the blue tones shift, but the colors on the opposite side of the color wheel will also be affected. The same goes for the saturation slider. This means we can get way finer and more creative adjustments through these sliders than we would be able to with the global saturation or vibrance. In the end, this just looks so much better and is a great starting point. Making the subject pop in our flower images is super easy. All we need to do is make use of Lightroom's masking tools. We want to separate the background from the flower, and we can do that with a simple subject mask. This way we can not only work specifically on our flower, but we can use the subject mask, invert it, and thus create a perfect mask targeting the background. And this way the background can easily be made darker without affecting the subject, adding beautiful contrast to the image. We can further build on this method to create light and shadow, adding amazing effects. Let's target the bottom of our image using a linear gradient. Since we don't want to alter the subject, we need to subtract a subject mask from this linear gradient. Now we can make the bottom darker by bringing down the exposure. And thus we are creating shadow. Similarly, we can create light. This should come from the top. Again, I don't want to change the subject, so we want to subtract it again from this linear gradient. Then we can raise things like exposure, whites, or even the blacks for a softer, beautiful looking light effect. Just like with light and shadow, we can play around with warm and cold tones. Let's create a linear gradient from the bottom up. Then let's subtract the subject. Now I want to give the shadows of the image, which we have now targeted, a colder color tone. We can make it warmer or colder using the temperature slider. So let's bring down the temperature, making the bottom part with the shadows of the image a little colder. We can control the intensity of this effect using the saturation slider. I want the colder tones to be a little less intense, so I'm going to bring down the saturation. Then let's add a little bit of warmth. I'm using a radial gradient, which is coming down from the top. Again, I'm subtracting the subject since I don't want to change its appearance. I want the light that is coming down from the top to be warmer. That means I'm going to increase the temperature for the desired effect. And we can use the saturation to make it more intense. Bring up the blacks, so we will have a visible light effect, and that's how we can make use of cold and warm tones. With color contrast, we have another tool to further separate the background from our flower and make it pop. For this image, I start by creating a subject mask, then let's invert it to get a nice selection for the background. I also want to subtract a linear gradient coming down from the top to keep some variation in the back, which makes it look better. Then for the color contrast, by giving the background a blue tone, we can add a lot of punch, so let's reduce the temperature. If you don't like how the colors look, you could also use the tint slider. Let's tone down the tint a little bit, making the blue tones look a little bit more aqua-ish. Of course, for that color contrast, dropping the exposure is also very important. This will give us some deeper, rich blue tones. Then again, to make the colors more intense, we can raise the saturation slider. This way, we can fine-tune the color contrast, playing around with temperature and saturation. Now for the flower, use another subject mask. This time we are increasing the temperature. And again, we can also play around with the saturation for a more intense effect. And now we have created a very beautiful color contrast between the yellow bright flower and the dark bluish background. Just like with the global saturation and vibrance adjustments, I suggest to be careful with global texture and clarity changes. Let's assume we want to give our flower some more sharpness and clarity. If you use global texture to increase details, we will also affect the blurry background, which really doesn't need any sharpening. So for more quality, use another subject mask. And in here, if you scroll down, we can make use of texture and clarity, specifically targeting this flower without altering the background. By the way, sometimes Lightroom can't properly identify the subject. So if you are struggling with that, keep in mind you can always fine-tune the mask by subtracting unwanted parts of it. In this case, I'm simply subtracting a brush to clean up the selection in the back. If the background of your images lacks something interesting, you can try adding bokeh balls to it. For that, let's create a radial gradient. I'm going to place it somewhere behind the subject to create a more interesting effect. Now bring down the feather between 2 and 5. We want this bokeh ball to have a rather hard edge, but not too hard. Again, make sure to subtract the subject because we want to place the bokeh ball behind the flower. To give it a more realistic look, I'm also going to subtract a linear gradient, taking away a part from that bokeh ball from the bottom up. Then all you need to do is to very slightly raise the exposure. You can also raise the blacks, maybe even the whites if you want. And try playing around with the temperature slider to bring in some color variation. Just like that, we can create a bokeh ball. Of course, we can stack multiple differently sized bokeh balls on top. So let's just create a bunch of radial gradients. Always remember to subtract the subject. And also keep in mind we want to create differently sized radial gradients to keep it realistic. And again, let's subtract a linear gradient, taking away a part from this bokeh ball. Then let's raise the exposure very slightly. We don't want to overdo it. And let's raise the blacks. Wonderful. And that's how you create bokeh balls in Lightroom. Once you're done editing the raw image, it's time to apply some sharpening. Let's open up the details panel. Again, we don't want to sharpen a blurry background or areas without any texture. So how can we do this correctly? In the details panel, we can make use of the masking slider. Hold down the Alt key while adjusting it. Lightroom will show you with a black and white overlay which areas will get sharpened. This way we can easily target the important areas and apply sharpening only to those. Sometimes we shoot images that look good through the viewfinder, but when viewed on screen it doesn't work. Try and see if cropping helps to improve the composition. Bring the focus more onto your subject by cutting out unimportant areas around it. Also, rotating the image can help create a more pleasing composition by straightening lines. And that's it for the 9 editing tips for flower photography using Lightroom. Let me know which one of these tips and tricks you found the most helpful, and if you want to add anything, let me know in the comments as well. So I hope this whole video was interesting, and see you all next time.